There are mistakes a man can apologize for, and then there are mistakes that haunt him for the rest of his life. When His Grace, Duke Frederick Wynthorpe, agreed to marry Lady Josephine Hartwell, he believed he had made the smartest decision of his life. Her family's fortune would rescue his ancient duchy from ruin, and that was all that mattered. He never read a single one of her letters. He refused every invitation from her family. In 6 months of engagement, he never once cared enough to look into the eyes of the woman who would become his duchess. By the time he finally saw her, it was already too late. As the chapel doors opened, a stunned silence swept through England's most powerful nobles before the entire congregation gasped in disbelief. Frederick felt his heart stop. Every cruel assumption he had made, every insult, every moment of neglect, came crashing down in an instant. Because the woman walking toward him wasn't the bride he thought he had married. She was the one person who would teach him that some hearts cannot be won by titles, wealth, or desperate apologies. They must be earned. But before we discover how one arrogant duke lost the respect of the woman he should have cherished from the very beginning, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you enjoy stories of love, redemption, and justice, where kindness is rewarded, pride is humbled, and every ending is worth the journey. Now let's return to the day Duke Frederick Wynthorpe made the greatest mistake of his life. Chapter 1. The news spread through England's grandest drawing rooms faster than the morning papers. His Grace, Duke Frederick Wynthorpe, the proud guardian of one of the oldest ducal houses in the kingdom, was to marry Lady Josephine Hartwell, the only daughter of the immensely wealthy Earl of Hartwell. The announcement sent the aristocracy into a frenzy. At afternoon teas, ladies hid amused smiles behind painted fans. Gentlemen exchanged knowing glances over crystal glasses of brandy. Every ballroom echoed with the same conclusion. The Wynthorpe estate must be in worse condition than anyone imagined. It is obvious why the Duke agreed. They say the Hartwells are purchasing prestige, and they say the girl has spent her entire life hidden in the countryside. Some whispered she lacked beauty. Others claimed she was painfully shy. A few insisted there must be some terrible flaw that explained why such an heiress had never graced London's glittering season. No one truly knew Lady Josephine Hartwell, but that never stopped society from inventing its own version of her. Frederick Wynthorpe neither encouraged nor corrected the gossip. To him, none of it mattered. Late one afternoon, sunlight poured through the towering windows of Wynthorpe House as his solicitor carefully arranged documents across a mahogany desk. The Hartwell alliance will settle the estate's outstanding debts, the elderly man explained. The agricultural investments alone should restore Wynthorpe's finances within a year. Frederick signed each page without hesitation. His expression never changed. "This marriage secures my family's future," he said calmly. "That is all I require." The solicitor cleared his throat. "There is also a letter from Lady Josephine." Without looking up, Frederick reached for his seal. "File it away." "My lord, it appears to be handwritten." "So? It may be personal." Frederick leaned back in his chair. "She understands why this marriage exists." The solicitor hesitated. "Perhaps she hopes to know the man she is about to marry." Frederick offered the faintest smile. That would be an unnecessary disappointment. He returned to his paperwork. The unopened letter remained on the edge of his desk until the servant quietly removed it before dusk. The invitations soon followed. The Hartwell family requested Frederick's presence for a small dinner at Hartwell Manor. He declined. A private garden reception. He declined again. A family luncheon before the engagement announcement. Once more, he refused. Every invitation received the same courteous reply, prepared by his secretary. His Grace regrets that pressing affairs concerning the Wynthorpe estates prevent his attendance. The truth was far simpler. He never intended to go. One evening, inside the exclusive Ashford Gentlemen's Club, Frederick sat beside his oldest friend, Lord Charles Ashcombe. The fire crackled softly between them. Charles studied him for several moments before finally speaking. "Have you met her?" Frederick looked up from his newspaper. Who? Lady Josephine. No, you've never even visited Hartwell Manor. There has been no need. Charles frowned. You are marrying her. I am marrying an alliance. Charles placed his glass on the table. There is a difference. Frederick folded the newspaper with measured precision. My duty is to preserve Wynthorpe, and your duty to your future wife. My responsibility begins after the wedding. Charles shook his head slowly. No, Frederick. It begins now. Silence settled between them. Finally, Frederick stood. I have no interest in romantic fantasies. Charles watched his friend button his tailored coat. This has nothing to do with romance. Frederick paused. Then Charles spoke the words Frederick refused to hear. You can marry a stranger, but you should never choose to keep her one. Frederick left without answering. Several days later, another parcel arrived at Wynthorpe House. It was carefully wrapped in cream paper and sealed with the Hartwell family crest. The butler carried it into the Duke's study. A portrait from Hartwell Manor, Your Grace. Frederick barely glanced toward it. Leave it. When evening came, the portrait still rested untouched. The following morning, it remained exactly where it had been placed. By the week's end, a servant quietly moved it into a cabinet to make room for new correspondence. Frederick never once asked to see the face of the woman he intended to marry. Miles away, Hartwell Manor stood peacefully beneath the fading light of autumn. Lady Josephine sat beside a window overlooking the gardens she had loved since childhood. A fresh breeze carried the scent of roses through the open glass. In her hands rested a folded letter. It was the third she had written, and the third that had gone unanswered. Her mother entered quietly. You needn't write another. Josephine smiled, though sadness lingered behind her eyes. I know. Lady Hartwell sat beside her daughter. You've done everything kindness could ask of you. Josephine looked toward the gardens, where children from the estate laughed as they chased one another beneath ancient oak trees. I wasn't asking for affection. Her voice was almost a whisper. I simply hoped he might wish to know the woman he has agreed to marry. Her mother gently covered Josephine's hand with her own. A man's silence often says more than his words. Josephine nodded slowly. She had already begun to understand that truth. That evening, a trusted housekeeper entered with visible hesitation. My lady. Josephine looked up. I've just returned from London. And? The woman lowered her eyes. I heard people speaking of your engagement. Josephine's gentle smile remained. What were they saying? They believe His Grace accepted the marriage only because of your inheritance. The room fell silent. And, the housekeeper continued reluctantly, they said you should be grateful that a duke was willing to overlook whatever faults have kept you from society. The words lingered heavily in the air. For a brief moment, hurt flickered across Josephine's face, not because strangers believed the rumors, but because the man who could have silenced them had chosen not to. She rose from her chair and carefully folded the unanswered letter. There would be no fourth attempt. If Duke Frederick Wynthorpe had already decided who she was, without ever meeting her, she would never chase the respect he refused to give. One day, he would discover the truth for himself. But when that day came, it would not be because she had begged him to see her. It would be because he had finally opened his own eyes. Chapter 2. Long before London invented its version of Lady Josephine Hartwell, the people of Hartwell knew exactly who she was. To the widowed mother whose rent had quietly been paid during a bitter winter, she was an answered prayer. To the young blacksmith whose apprenticeship had been funded when his father fell ill, she was the reason he now owned his own forge. To the children whose laughter echoed through the village schoolhouse each morning, she was simply Lady Jo, the gentle noblewoman who never arrived without books tucked beneath her arm and a warm smile waiting for every child. Josephine never sought applause. She believed that the truest measure of nobility was not found in glittering ballrooms or ancient titles, but in the lives one quietly changed when no one was watching. While London's aristocracy danced beneath crystal chandeliers, Josephine spent her mornings walking through wheat fields alongside farmers, listening to their concerns before the harvest began. She knew every steward by name, every stable hand, every gardener, every maid who had faithfully served Hartwell Manor for decades, and they loved her, not because she would one day become a duchess, but because she had already become their champion. "Lady Josephine!" A young boy came running across the courtyard, clutching a basket nearly too large for his small arms. She knelt until they were eye level. "What have you there, Thomas?" "The first apples of the season," he said proudly. "Father said you should have them." Josephine smiled. "Then your father deserves the first taste, not me." She selected only one apple, before placing the basket back into the boy's hands. "Take the rest home." His eyes widened. "But they're for you, and seeing your family enjoy them will make me happier than eating them alone." The boy grinned, before racing back toward the orchard. Nearby workers exchanged quiet smiles. None of them were surprised. That was simply who Lady Josephine Hartwell had always been. Later that afternoon, Josephine met with the estate's steward inside the library. Stacks of ledgers covered the polished oak table. "The southern farms have exceeded expectations," the steward reported. "Your irrigation plans doubled this year's wheat yield." "And the cottages?" Josephine asked. "The repairs were completed last week." She nodded with quiet satisfaction. No family should spend another winter beneath a leaking roof. The steward looked at her with unmistakable admiration. "Your grandfather would have been proud." Josephine lowered her eyes modestly. "I only hope to leave the estate better than I found it." Outside the library windows, dozens of workers tended fields that had once struggled to produce enough grain to survive. Now, they flourished. Not because fortune had favored Hartwell, but because someone had cared enough to lead with wisdom instead of pride. That evening, Earl Richard Hartwell and Lady Catherine Hartwell joined their daughter in the drawing room. The fire burned softly as silence settled between them. Finally, Lord Hartwell spoke. "There is something you should know before the wedding." Josephine looked up. "You've often wondered why we kept you away from London's season." She smiled faintly. "I assumed you wished for a quieter life." "We wished for a safer one," Lady Catherine answered gently. Josephine frowned. Her father continued. "When your grandfather's fortune passed to our family, proposals began arriving almost immediately. Not because they admired you, but because they admired what you would inherit." He sighed heavily. "We watched ambitious men pursue titles, wealth, and influence, while caring nothing for character. So we made a difficult choice. We allowed society to believe you preferred country life. We let the gossip continue. It was kinder than placing you before people who would only measure your worth in gold." Josephine remained silent for a long moment. "So the rumors were never corrected," her mother admitted. "We believed the right man would look beyond gossip." A shadow crossed Josephine's face. "And if he never does?" Neither parent answered immediately. The silence itself became their answer. As wedding preparations quietly unfolded, bolts of silk arrived from London. Jewels were inspected. Guest lists expanded. Carriages came and went from Hartwell Manor. Yet despite all the excitement surrounding the approaching ceremony, Josephine found herself thinking less about dresses and flowers, and more about the stranger she would soon call her husband. She had heard countless stories about Duke Frederick Wynthorpe, honorable, disciplined, devoted to his family legacy. Surely, she thought, there had to be more to him than the cold silence she had experienced. Perhaps duty had simply occupied him. Perhaps once they met, everything would feel different. Holding on to that fragile hope, Josephine sat at her writing desk one final time. Her pen moved carefully across the cream-colored paper, not with demands, not with complaints, only with honesty. She wrote that she understood the responsibilities carried by a duke. She wished him peace as the wedding approached, and she hoped that when they finally met, they might begin their marriage not as strangers bound by obligation, but as two people willing to show one another kindness. She sealed the letter with the Hartwell crest, then handed it personally to the waiting courier. Several days later, the courier returned. Josephine recognized the expression on his face before he spoke a single word. He removed the untouched letter from his satchel. The Duke's secretary accepted it, my lady. And he instructed me to inform you that His Grace appreciates your correspondence. Josephine looked toward the unopened seal. He never read it. The courier lowered his head. No, my lady. For only a heartbeat. Disappointment clouded her gentle features. Then, just as quietly as it had appeared, it disappeared. She accepted the letter without another question. There would be no more letters. No more reaching across a distance that only one person wished to cross. If kindness could not open the Duke's heart, persistence never would. Josephine carefully placed the unopened letter inside the drawer of her writing desk. One day, perhaps, Frederick Wynthorpe would realize that the greatest treasure ever offered to him had arrived not in the form of wealth, but in the quiet heart of a woman he had never cared enough to know. Chapter 3. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and cloudless, as though even the heavens had chosen to witness the union everyone in England was talking about. By the time the bells of St. Albans Chapel began to ring, elegant carriages stretched along the cobbled streets for nearly a mile. Dukes, duchesses, earls, marchionesses, bishops, military officers, and members of Parliament filled the magnificent chapel until scarcely an empty pew remained. But they had not gathered for romance. They had come for spectacle. Whispers drifted beneath the vaulted ceilings, like restless ghosts. So this is the Hartwell heiress. They say she's never attended a single London season. I heard she's terribly plain. The Duke must truly need the money. Behind embroidered fans and polished smiles, quiet laughter rippled through the congregation. No one noticed the groom. At the altar stood His Grace, Duke Frederick Wynthorpe, dressed impeccably in a tailored black morning coat trimmed with silver embroidery. Every inch of him reflected generations of aristocratic dignity, yet his thoughts were nowhere inside the chapel. His attention wandered instead to estate ledgers waiting on his desk, overdue repairs at Wynthorpe Hall, and the financial burdens this marriage would finally erase. Marriage, to Frederick, was not the beginning of a love story. It was the conclusion of a business negotiation. His gaze remained fixed ahead. He never once turned toward the great wooden doors behind him. Lord Charles Ashcombe, standing beside him as his best man, studied his friend's detached expression. "You still haven't seen her?" Frederick answered without emotion. "No." Charles sighed quietly. "You've had every opportunity." "I had no reason. You may discover today that you did." Frederick gave the faintest shrug. "The ceremony will last less than an hour." Charles looked at him with disappointment. "I wasn't speaking about the ceremony." Before Frederick could reply, the organ thundered through the chapel. Every conversation stopped. The massive oak doors slowly began to open. An expectant silence swept across the congregation. Hundreds of eyes turned toward the entrance. Frederick remained facing the altar. Only when he noticed the complete silence behind him did he slowly turn, and in that instant, time seemed to abandon him. Standing beneath the morning sunlight was Lady Josephine Hartwell. She wore an ivory silk gown that shimmered softly with every graceful step she took. Delicate lace flowed from her sleeves like strands of morning mist, while a cathedral-length veil rested gently behind her without hiding her face. But it wasn't the gown that silenced the church. It was her. Josephine walked with the calm confidence of a woman who needed no one's approval. Her posture was elegant without arrogance. Her expression was peaceful, yet dignified. She neither searched the room for admiration nor acknowledged the stunned faces surrounding her. She simply walked forward, one measured step after another. The whispers vanished. Fans stopped moving. Even the restless children seemed frozen. An elderly duchess lowered her spectacles in disbelief. "My heavens," another nobleman whispered. "She is extraordinary." A bishop standing near the front smiled quietly. "It appears society has been wrong." Frederick couldn't breathe. Every rumor he had accepted without question, every letter he had ignored, every invitation he had declined, every careless assumption, collapsed inside him all at once. She wasn't merely beautiful. There was something far more powerful about her. A quiet strength, a composed intelligence, a grace that no jewel or title could ever create. For the first time in many months, Frederick wished he had opened a letter. Any letter. Josephine finally reached the altar. Her father gently placed her hand into Frederick's. Her fingers were cool, steady. She did not tremble. She did not lower her eyes. Instead, she met Frederick's gaze for the very first time. There was no anger there, no bitterness, only quiet distance, the kind that forms when hope has already been surrendered, for reasons he could not explain. That hurt far more than anger ever could. The ceremony began. The minister's voice echoed gently through the chapel as sacred vows filled the air. Frederick spoke every word correctly, yet his thoughts refused to settle. He found himself stealing glances toward Josephine. The woman he had never cared enough to know now stood beside him as his duchess, and somehow she already felt impossibly far away. When Josephine repeated her vows, her voice was calm and unwavering. Not once did she hesitate. Not once did emotion crack her composure. She honored every promise with quiet sincerity. It struck Frederick then. She had entered this marriage with dignity, despite receiving none from him. Moments later, the minister pronounced them husband and wife. Applause filled the chapel, but Frederick scarcely heard it. As they walked together down the aisle, society's whispers had completely changed. She's magnificent. No wonder the Hartwells protected her. The Duke is a fortunate man. Each compliment landed like another reminder of his own blindness. Outside the chapel, photographers prepared their cumbersome cameras while guests gathered beneath the bright afternoon sky. For the first time since the ceremony began, Frederick turned fully toward his bride. "You look," he began, searching for words that suddenly felt painfully inadequate. "You look remarkable." Josephine regarded him politely. "Thank you, Your Grace." He waited. Surely she would smile, perhaps even laugh softly. Instead, she remained composed. "I owe you an apology," Frederick said quietly. "I should have. You owe me nothing today," Josephine interrupted gently. Her voice was soft enough that only he could hear. "We have fulfilled our family's wishes." There was no accusation in her tone, only truth. Frederick swallowed. "I would like the opportunity to know you." A faint breeze stirred the edge of Josephine's veil. She looked at him with calm, thoughtful eyes. "I once hoped for that opportunity as well." The words struck him harder than any public humiliation ever could. She continued, "I shall honor every responsibility this marriage requires. I will serve Wynthorpe faithfully. I will respect your name." Then her expression softened, not with affection, but with quiet resolve. But respect offered after indifference cannot erase the silence that came before it. Frederick stood speechless. Josephine offered him a courteous nod before turning to greet waiting guests with the same grace she had shown throughout the day. Watching her walk away, Frederick felt something unfamiliar settle heavily upon his heart. For months, he had believed he was entering a marriage that would change nothing. Instead, before the wedding day had even ended, he had already lost something he had never realized was precious. And for the first time in his life, the proud Duke of Wynthorpe discovered that regret could arrive far too late. Chapter 4. London expected its newest Duchess to spend her first weeks dazzling ballrooms with expensive gowns and carefully rehearsed smiles. Instead, Lady Josephine Wynthorpe quietly disappeared from society for 3 days. Naturally, the gossip began. "Perhaps she isn't as confident as she appeared. I suppose country manners can only survive one wedding. The Duke may already regret his decision." But while the aristocracy indulged in speculation, Josephine was doing something none of them expected. She was learning every corner of Wynthorpe Hall. She walked through the servants' corridors long before sunrise. She visited the kitchens while breakfast was being prepared. She stepped inside the laundry rooms, the stables, the gardens, and the estate offices, not to inspect people, but to know them. She greeted every servant by name after hearing it only once. She asked questions no noble had bothered to ask in years. "How long have you served here? Is your family well? What would make your work easier?" At first, no one believed her kindness was genuine, Years of serving distant masters had taught them to expect commands, not conversations. Yet Josephine asked for nothing she wasn't willing to understand. By the end of the week, the fear that had long lingered inside Wynthorpe Hall had begun to fade. Mrs. Beatrice Ellis, the elderly housekeeper who had served 3 generations of Wynthorpe dukes, watched the young Duchess carefully. One afternoon, Josephine found her struggling to carry a heavy basket of freshly pressed linens up the grand staircase. Without hesitation, Josephine reached for one side. Mrs. Ellis nearly dropped the basket. "Your Grace, please." "It isn't proper," Josephine smiled warmly. "Neither is allowing someone twice my age to carry this alone." The old housekeeper looked around in panic. "If the Duke were to see, then perhaps," Josephine replied gently, "he might offer to help us both." Mrs. Ellis couldn't remember the last time anyone had made her laugh. By evening, every servant in Wynthorpe Hall had heard the story, not because a duchess had carried linens, but because she had treated a servant as though her dignity mattered. Respect, they realized, was contagious. Within a fortnight, Josephine requested the estate's financial ledgers. The steward hesitated. "They've always been reviewed exclusively by His Grace." Josephine looked at the towering stack of account books. Then perhaps it's time another pair of eyes examined them. For 2 days, she read every page, every invoice, every contract, every forgotten expense. When she finally closed the last ledger, she quietly summoned the steward. "Why are we paying 3 different suppliers for the same grain shipment?" The steward blinked. I never noticed." "And why has the North Orchard remained abandoned for 6 years?" "It was considered too costly to restore." Josephine smiled thoughtfully. "Only because no one calculated what it might produce if restored. Within days, unnecessary contracts were cancelled. Wasteful spending disappeared. Plans were drawn to revive neglected farmland." The steward, who had spent years believing the estate's decline was inevitable, stared at the reports in disbelief. "Your Grace, I've never seen anyone understand these accounts so quickly." Josephine simply closed the ledger. "My father always said, an estate is like a family. If you ignore small problems long enough, they eventually become impossible to hide." Word of the Duchess's quiet accomplishments spread through London far faster than anyone expected. But it wasn't her beauty society discussed anymore. It was her character. At charity hospitals, donations suddenly arrived without public announcements. An orphanage that had struggled for months received enough funding to remain open through winter. A scholarship was quietly established for the daughters of fallen soldiers. Every generous act bore the same instruction: "Do not announce my name." Of course, London announced it anyway. Soon invitations flooded Wynthorpe Hall. Hostesses competed desperately for Josephine's attendance. Ladies who had once mocked the mysterious Hartwell heiress now spoke proudly of having met her. Gentlemen praised her intelligence after sharing only a single conversation. The very people who had laughed behind their fans now sought her approval. Frederick watched it all unfold with growing disbelief. One evening, he entered the ballroom of Lady Wynthorpe's annual charity gala. Conversations stopped, not because he had arrived, but because Josephine had. Guests gathered around her in effortless circles. A retired admiral laughed heartily at one of her observations. A renowned physician sought her opinion on funding a children's hospital. An elderly duchess affectionately squeezed her hand before introducing her to yet another distinguished guest. Frederick stood alone. No one ignored him. They still bowed, still greeted him with perfect etiquette. But something had changed. Respect given to a title was not the same as admiration freely given to a person. For the first time, he understood the difference. Lord Charles quietly appeared beside him. "I warned you." Frederick kept watching Josephine. "I know. You thought society admired power." Frederick gave a faint nod. Charles smiled sadly. "They admire kindness far longer." Later that evening, Frederick found Josephine standing alone on the terrace, overlooking the illuminated gardens. Moonlight rested softly across the marble balustrade. "You've become quite popular," he said. Josephine smiled politely. I've simply met kind people. I don't believe they're interested only in kindness. She looked toward the stars. I hope not. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Frederick cleared his throat. I noticed what you've done for the estate and the charities. You've accomplished more in a few weeks than many nobles manage in years. Josephine turned toward him. Thank you. The words were sincere, but they carried no warmth. Frederick searched for something more to say. I confess, I underestimated you. Josephine regarded him quietly. No, she spoke without anger. You never estimated me at all. The words settled between them like winter frost. Frederick lowered his eyes. She was right. He hadn't misjudged her. He had never bothered to judge her at all. I'd like to change that, he said softly. Josephine's expression remained gentle. I believe people can change, Your Grace. Hope flickered briefly inside him. Then she continued. But change takes time. And trust. She looked toward the ballroom, where laughter drifted through the open doors. Takes even longer. With that, she inclined her head respectfully and returned to the celebration. Frederick remained alone beneath the moonlit sky. For weeks he had watched strangers discover the remarkable woman he had refused to know. Every compliment offered to Josephine reminded him of another opportunity he had wasted. Every smile she shared with others became another quiet reminder that admiration could never be demanded, especially from the one heart he had wounded before he ever tried to understand it. And as the music floated through the warm summer night, the Duke of Wynthorpe finally realized that winning a person's respect was infinitely easier than earning back the trust he had carelessly thrown away. Chapter 5. Summer slowly surrendered to autumn, and with the changing season came a truth Duke Frederick Wynthorpe could no longer ignore. The marriage had secured his family's future, but it had not erased years of neglect. One cold morning, Frederick sat alone in his study, surrounded by towering stacks of financial ledgers. Figures that had once seemed insignificant now painted a far darker picture than he had imagined. Unpaid maintenance, declining harvest profits, inflated supplier contracts, missing estate funds. The deeper he searched, the more unsettling the truth became. For years, he had trusted others to manage what generations of Wynthorpes had built, and many of those entrusted with that responsibility had quietly enriched themselves while the estate weakened beneath his name. A knock interrupted his thoughts. The estate's chief steward entered with lowered eyes. Your Grace, Frederick looked up. Speak plainly. The Eastern Mill requires immediate repairs. If the roof collapses before winter, we'll lose nearly half the grain storage. Frederick closed his eyes briefly. How long have you known? The steward hesitated. Nearly 3 years. 3 years? I reported it, but the previous estate manager assured everyone the repairs had been completed. Frederick's jaw tightened. They never were. Silence filled the room. For the first time in his life, Frederick realized that neglect carried consequences no title could conceal. The disappointments did not end there. Determined to secure additional investments, Frederick traveled into London to seek the advice of men who had once proudly called themselves his closest companions. The first gentleman claimed he had another engagement. The second politely declined a meeting. A third instructed his butler to say he was unexpectedly unavailable. Frederick understood the truth long before anyone dared speak it aloud. When Wynthorpe's wealth had seemed limitless, invitations had arrived almost daily. Now that difficult decisions and financial discipline had replaced lavish entertaining. The invitations had stopped. Even at White's Club, where laughter had once followed him through every room, conversations grew strangely brief. Old acquaintances offered polite smiles before drifting toward wealthier company. No one insulted him. No one needed to. Indifference could wound just as deeply. As Frederick stepped into the rain-soaked streets that evening, Lord Charles Ashcombe quietly caught up beside him. I was hoping I'd find you. Frederick forced a tired smile. You've come to remind me you were right. Charles looked at his oldest friend for a long moment. No, I came because I'm still your friend. Those simple words struck Frederick harder than any criticism. For perhaps the first time, he understood how few true friends he actually possessed. Back at Wynthorpe Hall, another kind of gathering was taking place. Josephine stood beneath an old oak tree near the village square, speaking with tenant farmers whose faces had been etched by years of uncertainty. One elderly farmer removed his cap respectfully. "Your Grace, the new seed contracts you arranged, they've saved this year's planting." Another stepped forward. "And the interest on our loans, I never believed a landlord would lower them." Josephine smiled gently. "If the estate prospers while its people suffer, then the estate isn't truly prosperous." The men exchanged grateful glances. No speeches followed, no applause, only quiet respect. From a distance, Frederick watched the scene unfold. No servant had announced Josephine's arrival. No guards surrounded her. She stood among the villagers as naturally as if she had known each family for years. Children ran toward her without hesitation. Mothers greeted her with genuine affection. Even the oldest laborers spoke to her with a warmth Frederick had rarely inspired, despite carrying the title of Duke. He suddenly understood something no ledger could explain. Authority could command obedience. Character earned loyalty. Over the following weeks, Josephine continued working quietly. She reorganized inefficient supply routes, negotiated fairer contracts with merchants, restored abandoned orchards, expanded apprenticeships for young craftsmen. Every improvement strengthened the estate. Yet whenever others praised her, she redirected the credit. "We're succeeding because everyone is working together." She never mentioned the countless late nights spent reviewing reports by candlelight, never spoke of the sacrifices hidden behind every success. Watching her became increasingly difficult for Frederick, not because he envied her, but because he finally saw the woman he had refused to know. One evening, as rain tapped softly against the library windows, Frederick found Josephine reviewing correspondence beside the fireplace. She looked up as he entered. "Good evening, Your Grace." He remained standing. "I've been looking through the estate accounts. I imagined you would. I discovered more than financial mistakes." Josephine quietly closed the ledger before her. Frederick took a slow breath. "I discovered my own." The room fell silent. "I spent years believing responsibility meant protecting my family's title." He looked toward the fire. "In truth, I neglected the very people that title was meant to serve." Josephine listened without interruption. "And I neglected you most of all." His voice grew quieter. "I ignored your letters. I judged you without meeting you. I allowed rumors to become my truth." He finally met her eyes. "I have no excuse, only regret." For several moments, Josephine said nothing. The crackling fire filled the silence between them. At last, she spoke. "Thank you." The words surprised him, for saying what should have been said. Hope stirred inside him, but Josephine continued. "An apology matters. It takes humility to admit we've been wrong." Frederick nodded slowly. "Then perhaps you'll forgive me." She looked at him with the same calm honesty that had always defined her. "I don't know if I can." His shoulders fell slightly. She wasn't cruel. She wasn't angry. She was simply truthful. "You wounded someone you never took the time to know." Her voice remained gentle. "Those wounds don't disappear because the right words finally arrive." Frederick lowered his eyes. "I understand. I don't believe you understand fully." He looked back up. "You've apologized because you've begun seeing who I am." She folded her hands quietly. "But lasting change isn't measured by what we say after regret. It's measured by what we choose to do every day afterward." The words lingered in the room long after she finished speaking. Frederick realized she hadn't closed the door on forgiveness. Neither had she opened it. She had simply placed the key somewhere only patience, humility, and consistency could reach. As he quietly left the library, the weight upon his heart felt strangely different. For the first time, regret was no longer his greatest burden. Becoming worthy of forgiveness was, and though the journey ahead would be far more difficult than offering an apology, For the first time in many years, Duke Frederick Wynthorpe found himself willing to take the first real step. Chapter 6. Winter arrived earlier than anyone expected. Dark clouds hung low over the rolling fields of Wynthorpe, and week after week, relentless rain drowned the crops before they could be harvested. Rivers burst their banks, roads disappeared beneath thick mud, and acres of wheat that had promised abundance rotted where they stood. Fear spread faster than the storm itself. Across neighboring estates, landlords began dismissing workers to reduce expenses. Families packed what little they owned, uncertain where they would find their next meal. Merchants doubled the price of grain, knowing desperation made honest bargaining impossible. Inside Wynthorpe Hall, anxious voices filled the council chamber. "We cannot afford to feed every tenant," one advisor insisted. "The estate must protect its own finances first," another argued. "If we continue spending at this rate, we'll bankrupt ourselves before spring." Frederick listened in silence. Months earlier, he might have agreed. Before he could speak, Josephine calmly rose from her chair. "If we abandon the people who built this estate," she said, "there will be no estate left to protect." The room fell quiet. She walked toward a large map spread across the oak table. "Our southern granaries still hold enough barley for 6 weeks if rationed properly." She pointed toward another section. "The orchards preserved more fruit than expected. Those supplies can be distributed to villages with the greatest need." Then she looked toward the steward. "How many horses remain strong enough to travel?" 32, Your Grace. "Then tomorrow morning, every one of them will leave carrying food." The steward hesitated. "And if winter lasts longer than expected?" Josephine answered without hesitation. "Then we shall face tomorrow when it arrives. No child under Wynthorpe's care will go hungry today." No one argued again. By sunrise the following morning, the courtyard of Wynthorpe Hall had transformed into a hive of activity. Servants loaded wagons with flour, blankets, preserved vegetables, and medicine. Stable hands harnessed horses, while village volunteers organized deliveries. At the center of it all stood Josephine. She wasn't giving orders from the warmth of the manor. She was lifting crates alongside everyone else. An elderly maid noticed her struggling with a heavy sack of grain. "Your Grace, please allow someone else." Josephine smiled. "If I ask others to carry burdens, I should be willing to carry one myself." The servants exchanged quiet glances. Once again, their Duchess led not by privilege, but by example. Frederick watched from the front steps. He remembered every conversation they had shared over the past months, every lesson she had taught without intending to, every truth he had been too proud to see. Without another word, he removed his tailored overcoat, rolled up the sleeves of his white shirt, and stepped toward the nearest wagon. The workers looked at him in surprise. "Your Grace, where do you need me?" The blacksmith blinked. "These flour barrels are headed for Ashbrook Village." Frederick grasped one end before the man could protest. "They won't move themselves." The barrel was heavier than he expected. By the time it reached the wagon, his shoulders burned and his hands ached. No one applauded. No one praised him. Another barrel waited. Then another, and another. By midday, mud stained his boots. Rain soaked through his shirt. His palms, soft from years of comfortable living, had begun to blister. Yet for the first time in years, the exhaustion he felt came from serving others instead of preserving appearances. As the days passed, Frederick refused to return to old habits. He rode alongside supply wagons through freezing rain. He helped repair broken bridges so food could reach isolated farms. When floodwaters destroyed a tenant family's cottage, he worked beside carpenters until temporary shelter stood before nightfall. One evening, after hours spent reinforcing a damaged barn, an elderly farmer approached him cautiously. The old man's hands were rough from decades of labor. "I've worked these lands for 42 years, he said. Frederick looked up. "My father served your grandfather." The farmer smiled faintly. "I never imagined I'd live to see a duke carrying timber beside ordinary men." Frederick wiped rainwater from his brow. "I should have done it much sooner." The old farmer reached out and shook his hand, not because tradition demanded it, but because respect inspired it. For reasons Frederick couldn't fully explain, that simple handshake meant more than every formal bow he had received in London's grandest ballrooms. Meanwhile, Josephine traveled from village to village, ensuring every family received supplies. She comforted frightened mothers, read stories to children sheltering inside church halls, arranged work for laborers whose fields had been destroyed. She remembered every name, every circumstance. No kindness was too small to deserve her attention. One snowy afternoon, she arrived at a remote farmhouse expecting another difficult conversation. Instead, she found laughter. Children were building a crooked snowman outside. Their father was repairing the roof. Inside the cottage, warm soup simmered over the fire. The woman of the house smiled as Josephine entered. "Your husband insisted on helping repair the roof himself." Josephine looked outside through the frost-covered window. There, balancing carefully across wooden beams, stood Frederick with 2 carpenters, securing fresh thatching against the wind. His face was streaked with mud. His gloves were torn. He laughed quietly as one of the men joked about his poor hammering skills. For a long moment, Josephine simply watched. There was no audience, no noble guests, no newspaper reporters, no opportunity for praise, only a man choosing to do difficult work because it needed to be done. Something softened inside her. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps. The smallest beginning of hope. That evening, as they returned to Wynthorpe Hall beneath a sky filled with stars, Frederick helped an exhausted stable boy unharness the horses before entering the manor. Josephine noticed. He never looked around to see who was watching. He simply did what needed doing. As they climbed the front steps together, she finally broke the comfortable silence. "The villagers spoke highly of you today." Frederick gave a tired smile. They were very generous. They were honest. He looked toward her. "I've spent most of my life believing respect came with my title." Josephine waited. "I was wrong." She nodded quietly. Yes. There was no harshness in her voice, only quiet agreement. After a moment, she added gently, "The people no longer see only their duke. They're beginning to see the man." Frederick's heart stirred. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't affection. But it was the first time Josephine had acknowledged his efforts without reminding him of his failures. As they entered the warm glow of Wynthorpe Hall, neither spoke another word. Outside, winter still gripped the land with unforgiving hands, but somewhere beneath the frozen earth, the first promise of spring had already begun to take root. Chapter 7. Winter finally loosened its icy grip, surrendering to the first gentle breath of spring. Across the Wynthorpe estate, green shoots pushed through the once frozen earth, and with them came something far more fragile than the new season: hope. The people spoke of it in quiet conversations outside village bakeries, in bustling marketplaces, and beneath the ancient oak trees that lined the estate roads. But surprisingly, they weren't speaking about the harvest. They were speaking about their duke. No one could point to a single grand moment that had changed their minds. Instead, it had been hundreds of small ones. Frederick no longer rode past laborers without greeting them. He remembered stable boys by name. He paused to ask elderly tenants about their health. When roofs needed repairing, he ensured materials arrived before excuses did. When disputes arose between neighboring farmers, he listened before passing judgment. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the distance between the Duke and his people disappeared. And for the first time in generations, Wynthorpe Hall no longer felt like a palace standing above the estate. It felt like the heart of it. One crisp morning, Frederick walked through the stables before sunrise. A young groom named William struggled to calm a frightened mare that had injured one of her legs. "Easy, girl," the boy whispered nervously. The horse reared again. Without hesitation, Frederick stepped beside him. "She's frightened, not angry," he said calmly. He rested a gentle hand against the mare's neck until her breathing slowed. William looked at him in amazement. "I thought your grace would send for the stable master." Frederick smiled faintly. So did I. The two of them shared a quiet laugh. It was a small moment, one that history would never record. Yet moments like these slowly rewrote the story people told about the Duke of Wynthorpe. Inside the manor, Josephine noticed the changes long before anyone spoke of them. She noticed that Frederick no longer ate hurried meals before disappearing into London. In fact, he rarely visited London at all. The extravagant dinners, the exclusive clubs, the endless social gatherings that had once consumed his evenings, all had quietly disappeared from his life. Instead, most nights found him seated in the library, studying estate reports or discussing future improvements with the steward. One evening, Josephine entered the library, carrying several financial journals. She expected to find the room empty. Instead, Frederick stood beside a large table covered with architectural drawings. He looked up and smiled. A genuine smile, not practiced, not formal, simply warm. "I was hoping you'd come." She glanced toward the plans. "What are these?" "The old workers' cottages." He spread one of the drawings across the table. "The roofs have lasted longer than anyone expected, but not much longer." Josephine studied the sketches. "You've redesigned the entire row. I asked the builders what they would change if money weren't an obstacle." She looked at him with quiet surprise. "And? They told me families need larger kitchens more than decorative stonework." Josephine couldn't help smiling. "So you listened." "I've discovered," Frederick said softly, "that the people doing the work usually know more than the people giving the orders." She looked at him for a long moment. "That's a valuable lesson." It was an expensive one. Their eyes met. For the first time since their wedding, the silence between them felt comfortable instead of painful. Days later, the village celebrated its annual spring fair. Children chased colorful ribbons through the square, while musicians played lively folk tunes. Josephine spent much of the afternoon speaking with local merchants. Frederick quietly wandered among the stalls. An elderly widow selling handmade blankets accidentally knocked over her display as a sudden gust of wind swept through the square. Before anyone else could react, Frederick dropped to one knee, gathering blankets from the muddy ground. "Oh, Your Grace! You needn't—" "I do," he answered gently. Together, they folded each blanket neatly. When the woman apologized for taking his time, Frederick simply smiled. "My time belongs here." Several villagers witnessed the exchange. None said anything. They simply watched. Later that evening, the story spread through every corner of the estate. Not because a duke had helped an elderly woman, but because he had done so believing no one was watching. That night, Josephine stood alone on the manor's west terrace, watching lanterns flicker across the distant village. Footsteps approached behind her. "I thought I'd find you here," Frederick said. "The stars always seem brighter from this side of the house." She smiled softly. "They do." For a while, they simply admired the quiet night together. Then Frederick spoke. "I used to believe respect came from being admired." Josephine turned toward him. "And now?" "I think it comes from making someone else's life a little easier." She studied him carefully. The confidence that once bordered on arrogance had been replaced by something quieter, something steadier. "I've been watching you," she admitted. He looked almost embarrassed. "I suspected as much. You've changed." Frederick lowered his gaze. "I'm trying." "I know." Those two words lingered in the cool evening air. He looked back at her. "Is it enough?" Josephine didn't answer immediately. Instead, she rested her hands against the stone railing. "It's enough for me to believe your kindness is genuine." Hope stirred inside him. "But trust," she smiled sadly, "grows much more slowly than flowers." Frederick nodded. "I'll wait." She looked at him then, and for the first time since they had met at the altar, she saw not the proud duke who had ignored her letters, but the man patiently trying to become someone worthy of reading them. Perhaps, she thought, the man she had hoped to meet months ago was finally beginning to appear. Their quiet moment ended with the distant sound of approaching horses. A stable hand hurried across the courtyard, carrying a sealed envelope. "Your Grace," he called urgently. "This arrived from London." Frederick accepted the letter and immediately recognized the black wax seal pressed into its fold. a raven surrounded by a crown. There was only one noble family in England who used that crest, the House of Blackwood. Frederick's expression darkened. Josephine noticed immediately. "What is it?" He broke the seal and quickly scanned the contents. The warmth that had slowly returned to his face disappeared. "Marquess Victor Blackwood," he said quietly. "He'll be arriving at Wynthorpe Hall in 3 days." Josephine frowned. "I've heard the name." "You've heard enough." Frederick folded the letter carefully. He never visits without wanting something. Far beyond the manor, thunder rolled across the dark horizon. The first storm clouds of spring gathered silently above Wynthorpe, and neither Frederick nor Josephine yet realized that the greatest test of their marriage had only just begun. Chapter 8. Marquess. Victor Blackwood arrived at Wynthorpe Hall with the polished smile of a gentleman and the patience of a predator. Tall, impeccably dressed, and celebrated in London's highest circles, Victor possessed the rare ability to make even the warmest greeting feel like a calculated move in a game only he understood. Frederick welcomed him with the courtesy expected between noblemen. Josephine welcomed him with something far more valuable: careful observation. There was a moment, a fleeting glance, as Victor's eyes swept across Wynthorpe Hall. Not admiration, calculation. It vanished almost as quickly as it appeared, but Josephine noticed. Within days, Victor became a familiar presence throughout the estate. He praised Frederick's recent improvements, complimented Josephine's charitable work, dined with neighboring landowners, laughed easily, spoke generously. Yet everywhere he went, he planted tiny seeds of doubt. "I hear the Duchess now oversees every financial decision. Wynthorpe has certainly changed. I wonder whether His Grace still commands his own estate." The remarks were never accusations, only harmless observations. But gossip, once planted, rarely needed encouragement to grow. Soon London was whispering again. "The Duke has surrendered control. They say Lady Josephine dictates every decision. Perhaps Wynthorpe has gained a duchess but lost its duke." Frederick heard the rumors. For the first time in his life, they did not wound his pride. They threatened his wife. The true betrayal came a week later. During a meeting with several grain merchants, the estate's chief steward rushed into the library, pale with alarm. "Your Grace." Frederick stood immediately. "What has happened?" "The contracts." "What contracts?" "The eastern farmland." He struggled to catch his breath. "They've been sold." Silence swept through the room. Frederick frowned. "Impossible. I never approved a sale." The steward spread several documents across the table. The signatures appeared genuine. Josephine stepped closer. Her eyes moved carefully across every page. Then she stopped. "These aren't genuine." Frederick looked at her. "You're certain?" She pointed toward the Duke's signature. "Your handwriting never slopes downward at the end." She turned another page, and the estate seal has been pressed too deeply. She looked up. These documents were forged. A heavy silence settled over the room. Only one person had recently shown unusual interest in those particular fields: Victor Blackwood. 3 days later, England's leading noble families gathered at Blackstone House for the annual Landowners' Council, a prestigious assembly where disputes over estates, investments, and inheritances were publicly addressed. Victor arrived looking perfectly composed. So did Frederick. But this time, he did not enter the hall alone. Josephine walked beside him. The whispers began immediately. "They've come together. Perhaps the rumors were false, or perhaps she's here to speak for him." Victor smiled politely as they approached. "My dear Frederick, what unfortunate business has brought us together?" Frederick's voice remained calm. "You already know." Victor raised an innocent eyebrow. "I'm afraid I don't." Josephine stepped forward. "Then allow us to explain." The vast chamber fell silent. Every noble turned toward the Duchess. Without raising her voice, without allowing emotion to cloud her words, she began presenting the evidence. The forged signatures, the altered estate seals, the falsified land registry, the payments that had quietly passed through companies secretly owned by Victor's business associates. One by one, The pieces fit together with undeniable precision. No accusations, only facts. Victor's confident smile began to fade. Finally, Victor laughed softly. "My dear Duchess, these are rather imaginative conclusions. You possess no proof that I orchestrated any of this." Before Josephine could answer, Frederick stepped forward. His voice echoed through the great chamber. "I do." Every eye shifted toward the Duke. Months earlier, Frederick might have remained silent, might have protected his own reputation, might even have questioned Josephine before questioning another nobleman. Not today. He placed another document upon the council table. "I instructed my solicitor to investigate the ownership records yesterday." The council chairman adjusted his spectacles. "The purchasing company," he looked up slowly, "belongs to Blackwood Holdings." A murmur spread through the room. Frederick continued, "And Blackwood Holdings reports directly to Marquis Victor Blackwood." Victor's expression hardened. "This proves nothing." "It proves enough," Frederick replied. "You attempted to exploit temporary weaknesses within my estate. You forged legal documents. And worse," his voice grew firmer, "you spread lies about my wife, in the hope that distrust would divide this household." The chamber became deathly still. Frederick looked directly at Victor. "The greatest mistake you made was believing I would ever allow that." Josephine turned toward her husband. For a brief moment, the proud Duke who had once ignored her letters seemed impossibly distant. Standing before England's nobility was a man willing to place truth above pride, a husband willing to risk public embarrassment rather than abandon the woman beside him. The council ordered an immediate investigation. Within hours, additional evidence emerged: secret correspondence, hidden financial transfers, witness testimony from a former Blackwood accountant who refused to remain silent any longer. By sunset, the verdict was unanimous. Every fraudulent contract was declared void. Victor's attempted acquisition of Wynthorpe lands was permanently cancelled. His reputation, carefully built over decades, collapsed in a single afternoon. As the council adjourned, the once confident Marquis walked through the grand hall alone. No noble hurried to greet him. No conversations welcomed him. The same society that had eagerly sought his favor now stepped quietly aside. His greatest weapon, his influence, had disappeared. Outside, the afternoon sun bathed the palace gardens in warm, golden light. Frederick and Josephine descended the stone steps together. Neither spoke immediately. At last, Josephine broke the silence. "You never hesitated." Frederick looked at her. "I spent too long failing to stand beside you." His voice was quiet. "I won't make that mistake again." Josephine searched his face. There was no performance, no attempt to impress her, only conviction. A gentle smile touched her lips before she looked ahead once more. It was small, almost imperceptible, but Frederick saw it, and somehow, that single smile felt more precious than every honor his title had ever brought him. For the first time since their marriage began, they did not walk as strangers bound only by duty. They walked as partners who had weathered their first great storm together. And though the road ahead still held challenges, neither of them faced it alone anymore. Chapter 9. The invitation arrived, with the royal seal pressed into crimson wax. It was addressed not only to His Grace, Duke Frederick Wynthorpe, but also to Her Grace, Duchess Josephine Wynthorpe. Their Majesties would host the annual royal spring reception at Windsor Castle, a gathering reserved for England's most distinguished noble families, military leaders, scholars, and philanthropists. It was more than a celebration. It was where reputations were quietly confirmed before the eyes of the kingdom. As their carriage rolled through the castle gates, Josephine gazed at the magnificent towers rising against the evening sky. Months ago, she would have entered such a gathering, carrying the weight of whispered judgments. Tonight, the whispers were very different. There she is, the Duchess of Wynthorpe, the woman who saved an entire estate, the lady who kept hundreds of families from starving. No one spoke of her fortune anymore. They spoke of her character, The grand ballroom shimmered beneath thousands of crystal chandeliers. An orchestra filled the room with elegant waltzes, while members of England's highest nobility exchanged greetings beneath gilded ceilings. As Frederick and Josephine entered together, conversations softened, heads turned. Not because a duke had arrived, but because the Duchess beside him had earned the admiration of an entire nation. An elderly countess stepped forward first. "Your Grace," she said warmly to Josephine, "our village school reopened because of your educational fund." A retired general bowed respectfully. "My soldiers' widows still speak your name with gratitude." Even the Archbishop offered a gentle smile. "Compassion," he said, "is the finest form of leadership." Josephine thanked each of them with the same humility she had always shown, never once claiming more credit than she believed she deserved. Frederick watched quietly from beside her. Months earlier, such attention might have stirred jealousy. Instead, he felt only pride. Later that evening, the master of ceremonies struck the marble floor with his staff. The music faded. Every conversation ceased. "Ladies and gentlemen, by command of their majesties, we pause this evening to recognize extraordinary service rendered to both crown and country." The vast ballroom fell silent. The royal chamberlain unfolded an elegant parchment. "For remarkable leadership during the recent agricultural crisis, for preserving livelihoods throughout the Wynthorpe estates, for advancing charitable works across multiple counties, and for demonstrating that true nobility is measured by service before self, the Crown proudly recognizes Her Grace, Josephine, Duchess of Wynthorpe." Applause filled the ballroom. It began politely, then steadily grew louder. Soon, every nobleman and noblewoman in attendance had risen to their feet. Josephine stood completely still. She had never sought recognition. She had never expected it. Slowly, she stepped forward as the royal chamberlain presented her with a beautifully engraved medal bearing the royal crest. "England thanks you," he said simply. Josephine lowered her head respectfully. "It has been my greatest privilege to serve." As the applause slowly faded, the chamberlain smiled toward Frederick. "Your Grace, it is customary that a family representative offer a few words." Frederick hadn't prepared a speech. He hadn't expected one. For a brief moment, he simply looked toward Josephine. She stood beneath the crystal lights, exactly as she had stood on their wedding day. Graceful, composed, never asking the world to notice her, only seeking to make it better. Frederick stepped forward. The ballroom grew quiet once more. "When I was younger," he began, "I believed titles were inherited. They are." He paused. "But honor must be earned." The room remained completely silent. "I was born Duke of Wynthorpe. I inherited magnificent lands, an ancient family name, and generations of privilege." His voice grew softer. "I believed those things made me worthy of respect." He turned toward Josephine. "I was wrong." Across the ballroom, Josephine's eyes widened slightly. Frederick continued. "The finest decisions made at Wynthorpe over the past year were not mine. The harvest that saved our people, the charities that restored hope, the schools that opened their doors, the homes rebuilt after the storms, the trust our tenants now place in our family." He smiled. "Every one of those blessings began with my Duchess." A quiet murmur spread through the gathered nobles. No duke had ever spoken so openly against his own pride. Frederick looked directly at Josephine. "When Lady Josephine Hartwell entered my life, I failed to see the extraordinary woman standing before me. I mistook kindness for weakness, quiet confidence for insignificance, and duty for something that required no gratitude." His voice caught for the first time. "I have spent every day since trying to become worthy of the wife I was too blind to appreciate." Many throughout the ballroom lowered their eyes. Some smiled, others quietly wiped away tears. Frederick took another slow breath. "If England admires Wynthorpe today, do not honor me. Honor the woman who reminded a foolish duke that leadership begins not with authority, but with compassion." He stepped back. The silence that followed seemed almost sacred. Then, the ballroom erupted. Applause thundered beneath the soaring ceilings. Not polite applause, not ceremonial applause, but heartfelt admiration, the kind that could never be commanded, only earned. Josephine stood motionless. She had imagined many futures when she first agreed to marry Frederick. She had imagined respect, partnership, perhaps, one day, friendship. She had never imagined hearing those words. Not before England, not before the crown, not before every person who had once believed she was nothing more than a wealthy bride. Frederick had given her something no title ever could. Recognition, not for her beauty, not for her fortune, but for the woman she had always been. As the applause slowly faded, their eyes met across the ballroom. This time, there was no distance between them, only quiet understanding. Josephine crossed the polished floor until she stood before him. Without speaking, she gently reached for his hand. It was the first time she had done so willingly since the day of their wedding. Frederick looked down at their joined hands, scarcely believing the moment was real. Josephine smiled through glistening eyes. "You finally saw me." Frederick's own eyes filled with emotion. "No," he whispered. "I finally learned how." And beneath the brilliant lights of Windsor Castle, before the eyes of England itself, the proud Duke, who had once valued titles above all else, discovered that the greatest honor of his life was not the one he had inherited, but the hand he now held, with gratitude, humility, and love. Chapter 10. Spring returned to Wynthorpe not with grand celebrations, but with quiet abundance. Golden wheat swayed gently beneath clear blue skies where barren fields had once stood. Children's laughter echoed through villages that had feared hunger only months before. Smoke curled peacefully from cottage chimneys. New orchards stretched across hillsides once left abandoned, and every road leading to Wynthorpe Hall carried merchants, craftsmen, and families whose futures no longer depended on hope alone. They depended on hard work, compassion, and two leaders who had learned that true greatness was measured not by power, but by service. No one spoke of Wynthorpe as the struggling duchy anymore. It had become the example others sought to follow. Neighboring landowners traveled from across England to study its farms, schools, and charitable programs. When they asked Frederick how he had transformed the estate so completely, he always gave the same answer. "I married a wiser person than myself," and he meant every word. One quiet afternoon, Frederick wandered alone through the west wing of Wynthorpe Hall. The household had begun restoring rooms left untouched for years. Dust-covered furniture stood beneath white linen sheets, while forgotten cabinets were carefully emptied one by one. As Frederick opened an old mahogany writing desk, something caught his eye. At the very back of the lowest drawer rested a small bundle tied neatly with faded blue ribbon. His heart slowed. He recognized the Hartwell family seal immediately. With trembling hands, he lifted the letters into the afternoon light. 3 letters, each one still unopened, each one addressed in Josephine's graceful handwriting, the very letters he had believed discarded months ago. He closed his eyes. How many chances had he ignored, without even realizing they were gifts? Carefully gathering the letters, Frederick left the room without another word. Near sunset, he found Josephine in the restored rose garden behind the manor. The same garden she had helped revive during her first weeks at Wynthorpe, now overflowed with fragrant blooms in every direction. She looked up as he approached. "You've been searching for me." "I have." He held out the small bundle. Josephine's expression softened the moment she recognized the ribbon. "My letters. I found them today." She accepted them gently, running her fingers across the untouched seals. "I thought they had been destroyed." So did I. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, Frederick broke the silence. "I've spent months wishing I could undo my mistakes." He looked at the letters in her hands. "I cannot, but perhaps," he swallowed hard, "I can finally listen." Josephine looked at him with quiet curiosity. Frederick carefully opened the first envelope. The paper had yellowed slightly with time. His voice was unsteady as he began to read. "Your Grace, though we have not yet met, I hope this letter finds you in good health. I know our marriage has been arranged by our families, but I hope that before duty joins our names, kindness might introduce our hearts." Frederick stopped. Emotion tightened his throat. He closed his eyes briefly before continuing. "I do not ask for affection, only the opportunity to know the man I shall spend my life beside." His voice broke. "I never even gave you that." Josephine remained silent, tears quietly gathering in her eyes. Frederick opened the second letter. In it, Josephine had written about the Hartwell orchards blooming in spring, wondering whether Wynthorpe's gardens looked the same. The third spoke of hope, not wealth, not titles, simply hope that mutual respect could become the foundation of their marriage. Each word felt like another reminder of the life they might have begun together. Had he only chosen to read them? When the final letter ended, Frederick folded it carefully. "I've apologized before," he said softly, "but today I finally understand what I stole." He looked directly into her eyes. "I stole time, the chance to become your friend before becoming your husband, the chance to spare you needless loneliness. No apology can return those moments." His voice grew quieter. "If I could relive one day of my life, it wouldn't be our wedding. It would be the day your first letter arrived. I would open it. I would ride to Hartwell Manor. And I would thank heaven for introducing me to the remarkable woman standing before me." Silence settled gently between them. Not the painful silence that had once divided them, but the peaceful silence shared between two hearts that finally understood one another. Josephine stepped closer. "I kept waiting for you to become the man I hoped you were." She smiled through tears. "For a long time, I believed he didn't exist." Frederick lowered his eyes. "I almost didn't." She reached up and gently placed her hand against his cheek. "But he does now." He looked at her, hardly daring to breathe. "You didn't change because you wanted forgiveness. You changed because you finally understood what it means to love." A single tear slipped down Frederick's face. "I do love you. I know." Josephine's smile grew warmer. "And today, I finally believe it." She took both of his hands in hers. "I forgive you, Frederick, not because you're the Duke of Wynthorpe, not because England admires you, but because every single day you chose to become a better man than the one I married. And that's the man I choose to spend the rest of my life beside." Frederick drew her gently into his embrace. This time, she didn't hesitate. She rested her head against his shoulder, as though it had always belonged there. Above them, the roses swayed softly in the evening breeze. As twilight settled over Wynthorpe Hall, the Duke and Duchess walked hand in hand through gardens now overflowing with life. The servants smiled as they passed. Children waved from across the lawns. Farmers tipped their hats with genuine affection rather than obligation. The people no longer followed them because of ancient titles. They followed them because they trusted their hearts. And perhaps that was the greatest victory of all. For fortunes can disappear. Titles may pass from one generation to the next. Great houses will one day crumble into history. But kindness leaves an inheritance no fire can consume. Humility builds a legacy no storm can destroy. And love, when it is earned through patience, sacrifice, and unwavering devotion, becomes the richest treasure anyone can ever possess. For in the end, Duke Frederick Wynthorpe did not save his duchy alone. He first allowed his duchess to save the man he was becoming, and only then, together, did they save everything else. Before we part ways, take a moment to think about this story. How different would Frederick and Josephine's lives have been if he had opened just one letter, if he had chosen kindness over assumption, if he had taken the time to truly know the woman standing beside him? Sometimes, the greatest mistakes we make aren't the harsh words we speak, but the opportunities we never give ourselves to understand another person's heart. Thankfully, Frederick learned that while the past can never be rewritten, the future can always be transformed through humility, courage, and love that is proven through actions, not promises. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video, Subscribe to the channel for more unforgettable Duke and Duchess stories filled with romance, redemption, justice, and emotional twists. And turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next journey. And before you go, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. If you were Josephine, would you have forgiven Frederick? Or would his mistakes have been too painful to forget? Thank you for spending your time with us today. Until our next story, may you always remember that true nobility is never measured by titles or wealth, but by the kindness we choose to show, the trust we earn, and the love we give when no one is watching.